Welcome to Echoes of History. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization NATO was publicly founded as the shield of Western democracy against the Soviet threat. Yet beneath this public defense, a chilling clandestine mechanism operated across the heart of Europe. This was Operation Gladio, NATO's secret, stay-behind armies. This is not a tale of heroes, it is a brutal, realistic account of strategic paranoia and the moral compromises made in the name of containment. The primary objective was to resist a Soviet invasion, but the shadow armies of Gladio, nurtured by Western intelligence, soon found a new target: their own democracies. They evolved from a military insurance policy into a potent force of domestic political manipulation. This is the harrowing story of how the very alliance created to protect democracy may have in fact become its most dangerous internal threat. The geopolitical reality of the post-World War II era was stark. The formidable size of the Soviet Red Army meant that any land invasion of Western Europe would likely succeed initially. Western leaders, haunted by the swift collapse of countries during the Nazi Blitzkrieg, needed a failsafe. The solution, coordinated primarily by NATO and spearheaded by the CIA and Britain's MI6, was the creation of stay-behind paramilitary networks. These were secret, decentralized units, initially composed of fiercely anti-communist veterans, ex-fascists, and intelligence operatives. Their designated mission: to remain behind enemy lines following a Soviet takeover, conducting espionage, sabotage, and guerrilla warfare. The codename for the Italian network was Gladio. Similar networks existed across virtually every Western European NATO member and neutral states like Switzerland. Their existence was known only to the highest levels of government and intelligence. This was the ultimate expression of the Cold War's ruthless logic, a network designed to kill and destabilize, maintained in a peacetime setting. Arms caches containing everything from explosives to communication equipment were secretly buried across the European countryside, awaiting the day of invasion. The problem was that the network, trained and funded with lethal efficiency, found itself idle during decades of uneasy peace. The doctrine began to shift. What happens when a secret army, built on extreme ideology and armed for total war, starts looking inward for a threat? The answer was a slow, terrifying transition from an external defense mechanism to an internal political weapon. As the Cold War matured, the perceived threat was no longer solely a Soviet tank division crossing the Fulda Gap. It became the internal threat, the rise of powerful, democratically elected communist and socialist parties in countries like Italy, Greece, and Portugal. The very idea of a Western democracy voting itself out of NATO's orbit was seen as a strategic catastrophe, a victory for Moscow without firing a shot. This fear led to the implementation of the strategy of tension, strategia della tensione, particularly in Italy, the primary theater of the Gladio investigations. The purpose was to prevent a political shift to the left by creating chaos and fear among the population. The strategy was simple and chillingly effective: false flag terrorism. Right-wing Gladio operatives, often linked to neo-fascist groups, would execute brutal bombings and massacres, which would then be blamed on the political left, specifically communist or anarchist groups. The goal was twofold: to discredit the political left and to generate enough public panic and demand for law and order to justify a strengthened authoritarian state, one guaranteed to remain loyal to NATO. The 1969 Piazza Fontana bombing in Milan, the 1980 Bologna railway station massacre, and countless other acts of violence across the years of lead were eventually linked by investigators to these clandestine far-right and intelligence circles. The irony is grim. A network established to defend freedom used terror and murder to undermine democracy from within. The Gladio architecture was not confined to Italy. It was a pan-European NATO-backed reality, often operating through different proxy names and with varying degrees of success and brutality. In Greece, following the 1967 military coup, the local stay-behind network, the Hellenic Raiding Force, was accused of supporting the dictatorship and persecuting democratic opposition. In Turkey, the network was known as the counter-guerrilla. Its existence was linked to extreme violence, including torture and extrajudicial killings aimed at suppressing Kurdish and left-wing political movements throughout the 1970s and 80s. These groups effectively served as the deep state, a permanent, unelected security apparatus designed to enforce a specific pro-Western political order, regardless of the democratic will. The most shocking realization came from Belgium in the 1980s, where the infamous Brabant killings, a series of indiscriminate massacres at supermarkets, were also controversially linked to elements of the Gladio network. These investigations suggest a terrifying level of operational independence and ruthlessness, where the preservation of the anti-communist security state became a justification for domestic slaughter. The official public revelation of Operation Gladio came in 1990, driven largely by the persistent work of Italian magistrates and whistleblowers. The ensuing political storm forced several governments, including those of Italy, Belgium, and Germany, to admit the existence of their respective stay-behind armies. However, the true extent of their involvement in false flag terrorism and political destabilization remains fiercely debated and, for many, deeply buried beneath decades of state secrecy and compromised investigations. This ambiguity is perhaps the network's most lasting legacy, the persistent suspicion that deep state forces remain capable of overriding democratic processes when deemed necessary. Operation Gladio, officially dismantled in the early 1990s, left behind a profound and bitter echo in modern political life. The legacy is twofold: institutional mistrust and the normalization of the deep state narrative. Firstly, the revelation of Gladio shattered the public trust in security services and international alliances across Europe. If democratic governments could secretly maintain armed, ideologically extreme forces capable of murdering their own citizens to achieve political ends, what truly defines a democracy? This historical wound has fueled much of the modern skepticism towards established political power and intelligence agencies. Secondly, Gladio established the terrifying precedent that a security state, once created, rarely adheres strictly to its original mandate. The stay-behind philosophy, maintaining a hidden army ready to act, has evolved into the modern concept of the cyber stay-behind network. Undisclosed capabilities, surveillance programs, and cyber warfare capacities held by security agencies capable of targeting internal dissent or political opposition under the guise of national security. The methods have changed from explosives in a train station to algorithmic manipulation and large-scale disinformation campaigns. But the objective remains chillingly similar: to create a strategy of tension, fear, polarization, and chaos, to guide public opinion away from specific political outcomes. The story of Operation Gladio serves as a brutal historical lesson that the greatest threats to democracy are not always external. They can be manufactured internally, funded by the very institutions meant to protect the populace. The Cold War's deepest secret was that the alliance built to fight tyranny abroad maintained its own brutal shadow army to suppress political change at home. The echoes of that political ruthlessness still reverberate every time we question the official narrative behind a sudden crisis or a violent political disruption. Thank you for watching. To explore more untold and often unsettling echoes of the past, be sure to subscribe and like this video. We'll see you in the next installment.